Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today we continue the series about what you can do with specific speculative fiction archetypes, and since I covered elves a while back, today we'll be looking at what's probably the second most commonly seen fantasy race, Dwarves. We can all thank Tolkien for that one, but there's more to fantasy dwarves than just what he wrote. So, let's dig in. What is a dwarf? While dwarves are commonly seen throughout fantasy fiction, it's actually remarkable how similar they are each time they make an appearance. Plenty of authors have come up with plenty of worlds with dwarves in them, but those dwarves have a lot in common with one another. Dwarves tend to be short, live underground in vast caverns they carve from the stone, and they take great pride in their facial hair. In fact, in many settings, dwarven females can grow just as much facial hair as dwarven males. In terms of personality, dwarves tend to be gruff, work-oriented, and deeply interested in precious metals, gems, and metallurgy. I should also mention the mythological origin of dwarves. Much like elves, dwarves come from Old Germanic mythology, and there's reason to believe that originally the two were considered different varieties of the same being. Specifically, there were both light elves and dark elves, and the description of dark elves in some sources was basically the same as the description of dwarves in other sources. Specifically, Norse dwarves live underground, have dark skin, create magic artifacts and weapons, and often appear as troublemakers in Norse legends. The whole height thing wasn't present in the early sources, and it may have been a mistranslation during the Christianization process. The dwarves were considered a lesser race compared to the giants and the gods, and at some point lesser was taken to mean smaller instead of just less powerful. The Mundane Supernatural. Something that's remarkable about fantasy dwarves is that, while they have a stronger connection to magic and nature than humans, just like elves, the way they express this connection is very different. Since dwarves traditionally live underground and often live at great depths, the nature they're familiar with is the nature of geology, rather than zoology and botany. Dwarves have an intrinsic understanding of fault lines, earthquakes, mineral deposits, ore mining, and so on. Then there's the dwarven connection to magic. Dwarves are only rarely depicted as spellcasters, and instead their magic is channeled into the items they create. These magic items can then be used by dwarves, or by humans, or by anyone else who happens to get their hands on them. And in the meantime, when dwarves are not in the forge or the smithy, their powers and abilities are just as limited as the average humans. I think this mundane aspect of dwarves is the reason why they're generally depicted as having round ears, when so many fantasy races have pointed ears. Dwarves as the Bygone Empire. Because dwarves are frequently depicted as great builders and crafters, it's not a big stretch to use them as the source of all the ruins and powerful artifacts that fill your setting. Perhaps the dwarves had a great underground empire that crossed the known world, and the highways and cities they built are still down there, buried under millions of tons of shifting stone, and yet still recognizable. Or perhaps the Dwarven Empire covered the surface, and it's only in modern times that dwarves restrict themselves to living underground. As for what happened to the dwarves, that is entirely for you to decide. Maybe they dug too greedily and too deep, and some evil power buried deep underground broke free and destroyed the Dwarven Empire. Perhaps some magical but natural disaster struck, and it was beyond even the dwarves' ability to repair. Maybe some magical mineral the dwarves mined corrupted them and turned them into mindless monsters. Or maybe their empire collapsed because of real-world problems, like bad leadership, climate change, and outside invasions. You should also ask yourself whether dwarves are still around after their empire collapsed, and whether modern dwarves still know the empire's secrets, or whether they've been lost to time. Dwarves as mercantile masters. Dwarves are commonly associated with precious metals, mines, building, and crafting, all of which are very profitable industries. On top of this, dwarves are often portrayed as being greedy, as being obsessed with collecting as much material wealth as possible while spending as little of it as they can get away with. As such, if dwarves play an active role in your setting, then it would make sense for them to take advantage of all these natural affinities and become an economic powerhouse. If dwarves are a source of wealth in your setting, you should also decide just how much control dwarves have over merchants and the trading process. For instance, in Dragon Age, dwarves have a monopoly on the production of lyrium, since only dwarves can handle raw lyrium safely. However, dwarves also have a cultural aversion to sunlight, and so they mostly just sell processed lyrium to humans and elves and let them handle most of the distribution. On the other hand, in the Witcher series, not only are dwarves the main source of iron equipment in the Northern Realms, they're also active figures in the financial markets, and some of the world's biggest banks are owned and operated by dwarven families. Dwarves as technology leaders. Dwarven magic is the magic of crafting, the magic of powerful objects with unique properties. And if you think about it, that can also describe advanced technology. So, what if dwarven magic is technology? Instead of crafting magic rings and glowing swords, the dwarves of your world are crafters of blast furnaces, geothermal energy pumps, and steam engines. If your setting also features magic and technology as opposing forces, then you could use elves and dwarves to represent each side. Or maybe the opposite is true, and your setting's magic benefits from advancing technology. In that case, the dwarven affinity for both magic and industry would naturally place them at the center of whatever magitech industrial revolution you create. In this case, not only are dwarves an active force within your setting, their best days are yet to come. And with a technology advantage, your dwarves may end up starting a big colonizing empire. Dwarves as isolated clans. On the other hand, maybe your dwarves aren't the kind of people who want to rule the world. In the video game Arcanum, dwarves have always been masters of technology, but they keep that technology locked away in their isolated mountain homes. The only reason the Industrial Revolution starts is because a human befriends a dwarven clan, learns how to build a steam engine from them, and then shares that information with other humans. The idea that dwarves prefer to avoid contact with other races is also supported by the original Germanic myths. Compared to elves and giants, dwarves barely come up, and they always seem reluctant to share their creations with outsiders. So instead of having dwarves be an active force within your setting, and instead of having them be some ancient builders of ruins, what if dwarves are a mysterious people who live in distant, inhospitable lands, and are so rarely encountered that some believe them to be fictional or mythological? It could be that even finding a dwarven home is a major story beat, and convincing them to contribute anything to the plot is a significant undertaking. Dwarves as defensive specialists. A home built under a mountain can be a very easy home to defend. Imagine all the toughest defenses that a medieval castle has to offer, and then imagine that it takes less effort to build them, and there are no walls to breach. On top of that, maybe the dwarves of your setting hoard a lot of wealth, and thus become tempting targets. Or maybe there are hordes of demons or goblins who also live under mountains, and are thus a constant threat to dwarven strongholds. If all of this is true, then dwarves would quite naturally become very proficient in defending themselves. Of course, the real question is what to do with this information. Maybe your dwarves are isolated because they get constantly harassed by any other nation that finds out about their incredible wealth. Maybe your dwarves are the last line of protection, keeping vast demonic armies from overwhelming the surface. Or maybe your dwarves are fully engaged with the rest of the world, and because of their experience, dwarven architects are in high demand wherever castles and strongholds are being built. Dwarves don't have as much variety as elves do, at least not in existing media, but even if you don't do something completely different with dwarves, you still have plenty of wiggle room when it comes to the kind of role you want dwarves to fill. They could be ancient and hard to find, modern and cutting edge, or a weird combination of both. Dwarves are a magical people who don't use magic. and you can do all kinds of things with a dichotomy like that. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.